From the surface, the sea often appears still and empty, just water stretching quietly toward the horizon. Yet beneath quiet coastal waters, stone streets and walls remain exactly where people once built them, not erased by time, not broken by fire, but resting in silence below the waves. Stone walls, streets, stairways, and doorways now lie beneath the sea. Archaeologists have mapped entire cities underwater, not broken fragments or scattered ruins, but complete layouts with roads, courtyards, and neighborhoods still arranged as they once were. Divers have swum through spaces where people lived their daily lives, passing thresholds worn smooth by footsteps that ended long ago. These cities were not swallowed in a single disaster. In many places, the sea crept forward slowly, year after year, generation after generation. People rebuilt, adapted, and retreated until finally the water claimed what remained. In other cases, the ground beneath them weakened, and within only a few human lifetimes, entire ports slipped beneath the waves, quietly sealed by sand and silt. Some were once busy centers of trade and culture, built close to the water because the sea offered food, travel, and connection. Evidence reveals that fishermen, storms, and sonar surveys uncovered many of them by accident. Others were known only through ancient texts, doubted for centuries, until stone streets and towering statues emerged from the seabed, exactly where stories said they would be. Tonight, we move gently through these submerged cities, where the past still exists, just out of reach. But before we begin, I'd love to know, where on this planet are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment and tell me what time it is wherever you're winding down. And if these gentle rambles help you drift off to dreamland, please tap like and consider subscribing. So now take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and together let us drift downward, following the quiet outlines of cities still resting beneath the sea. Long before walls rose and names were carved into stone, the edge between land and water offered something rare, a meeting place where survival felt cooperative rather than contested. Coasts gathered abundance in ways interior landscapes could not. Fish moved predictably with the seasons. Shellfish clung to reachable shallows. Salt could be harvested without tools, more complex than patience. Rivers carried fresh water and fertile silt, renewing soil without effort. To early communities, the shoreline did not feel like a boundary, it felt like an invitation, a place where the living world gathered willingly. Movement followed the same gentle logic. Long before roads cut across continents, water already connected distant places. Rivers bent patiently through valleys, guiding travel without resistance. Coastlines unfolded like natural corridors, allowing boats to move heavier loads than human backs ever could. Timber, stone, grain, and metal could glide rather than strain. Settlements near water learned this early, watching exchange arrive on hulls and drift away again without leaving scars on the land. Trade did not need engineering at first. It needed only a shore and the confidence to step outward. As these routes grew familiar, ports became something more than landing points. They gathered language, belief, craft, and rhythm. Goods changed hands, but so did stories and techniques, arriving quietly with the tide. Markets formed not from conquest, but from proximity. Wealth accumulated slowly, layer by layer, reinforced by reliability. The sea returned each day with the same motions. Rivers rose and fell within rhythms that could be learned. To generations watching from the same stones, water felt patterned, dependable, almost conversational. This sense of trust shaped how cities took form. Builders aligned streets toward harbors, temples toward currents, homes toward prevailing breezes. Stone replaced wood, then stone replaced itself again, stronger and more deliberate. Foundations were sunk with care into soil that had always held. The waterline observed over lifetimes seemed fixed enough to become a reference point. No memory remained of distant ages when ice reshaped continents or seas climbed patiently over human absence. What could not be remembered could not be planned for. Even when changes appeared, they arrived softly. A pier extended to meet deeper water. A road shifted inland by small degrees. A harbor wall rose another course of stone. Each adjustment confirmed the belief that the relationship was manageable. Water gave warning through subtleties, not ultimatums. It asked for adaptation, and adaptation was granted. Generations passed, each inheriting a city that seemed secure because it had endured the memory of those who lived there. Time, however, was measuring itself differently. Beneath deltas and bays, sediment loosened and resettled. Currents carried weight unseen. Ground that felt solid learned to compress under its own saturation. Sea levels, responding to distant climates, adjusted with patience far longer than any one lifetime. These processes unfolded beyond notice, not because they were hidden, but because they moved too slowly to alarm. So cities remained where they had always been, pressed close to water that continued to feed them, connect them, and promise continuity. Builders had no reason to expect retreat from something that had never withdrawn before. Their trust was not careless, it was earned through stability that spanned generations. In that long calm, the sea became a partner rather than a threat, and civilization grew confidently along its edge, unaware that the balance it relied upon was quietly changing beneath the surface. Off the southern coast of Greece, where sunlight still reaches the seafloor, lies Pavlopetri, a city arranged with a clarity that feels almost deliberate. Its streets do not scatter or dissolve into suggestion. They intersect and turn with purpose, guiding movement the way they once guided daily life. From above, the layout appears calm and orderly, as if waiting for voices to return. From within, the city feels complete, not interrupted, simply paused. Stone roads trace gentle paths between buildings, wide enough to suggest planning rather than chance. Courtyards open inward, forming private pockets where light filters down through the water in slow, shifting patterns. The foundations of homes remain clearly defined, their walls outlining rooms that once held hearths, tools, and quiet routines. Even tombs rest within the city's boundaries, set apart with care, marking spaces where remembrance lived close to the rhythm of ordinary days. The city's structure speaks without urgency, revealing itself through patience rather than spectacle. What makes Pavlopetri unusual is not just what remains, but how little has been altered. There is no sign of collapse or chaos pressed into the stone. The streets were not broken apart by force, and the buildings were not scattered by sudden violence. Instead, the city seems to have been lowered gently, as if the land itself exhaled and allowed the sea to settle in its place. Layer by layer, water arrived, softening edges rather than shattering them, filling spaces that had already begun to loosen their hold on human presence. Time here stretches farther back than memory. Pavlopetri is dated to more than 3,000 years ago, placing it deep within an era when cities were still defining what permanence meant. The stone reflects techniques that belong to that distant world, shaped by hands that understood both durability and restraint. Yet, despite its age, the city feels accessible, almost familiar. The scale remains human. Doorways align with bodies, streets with footsteps, courtyards with gatherings that once returned to the same centers day after day. The way Pavlopetri entered the sea tells its own quiet story. Geological shifts along the coast slowly altered the balance beneath the city. Subtle movements in the earth encouraged water to linger where it had not before. Over generations, the shoreline adjusted by small increments, unnoticed in the span of a single lifetime. As foundations settled and ground weakened, the city yielded gradually, allowing structures to sink together rather than fall apart. Preservation followed surrender, not resistance. Because of this slow descent, Pavlo Petri offers rare clarity. Archaeologists were able to map an entire urban plan without reconstructing missing pieces. Roads connect logically. Spaces relate to one another as they were intended to. There is no need to imagine where people moved or how neighborhoods functioned. The evidence remains arranged, resting in place, precise enough to read like a diagram left behind on purpose. Pavlo Petri stands as one of the clearest underwater cities ever found, not because it is dramatic, but because it is intact. It shows a city that did not end, but transitioned. Life withdrew, structures remained, and water accepted the arrangement without rearranging it. In its stillness, the city offers continuity rather than loss. Stone continues to hold its shape, pathways continue to point somewhere, and time, slowed by the sea, allows the past to rest without erasing itself. Entering a submerged neighborhood begins with a change in rhythm rather than scenery. Movement slows, not because of resistance, but because the body adjusts to a space where gravity feels negotiated. Each motion becomes deliberate. Streets reveal themselves gradually, emerging from haze and suspended particles, their outlines sharpening as the water clears. What once functioned as ordinary ground now feels suspended, and distance is measured in careful strokes rather than steps. As one drifts forward, doorways appear first. Rectangular openings hold their proportions, framed in stone, still defining where walls once separated private from shared space. Thresholds remain slightly raised, just enough to catch drifting sand, marking the point where outside became inside. Foundations trace the boundaries of rooms with quiet precision, corners holding their angles, lines refusing to blur. There is no confusion about intention. These spaces were built to be entered, crossed, and returned to. Scale begins to register in unexpected ways. Without roofs or furniture, the mind measures by the body alone. A doorway reveals its human height by the way it frames the water beyond it. Streets widen enough for two people to pass, then narrow again, guiding movement as they always did. Courtyards open suddenly, giving a sense of pause, places where daily life once collected before dispersing again. The city does not feel miniature or monumental, it feels calibrated. Swimming through these spaces requires attention to detail. Fin tips hover carefully above stone to avoid stirring sediment that has settled for centuries. Hands remain close, not to touch, but to understand distance. The water carries sound differently, muting everything into a uniform hush. Breathing becomes the loudest presence, steady and contained, emphasizing how much noise once belonged to these rooms. Domestic spaces hold a particular weight. Rooms sized for sleep, work, and gathering remain readable, even without their contents. Walls turn inward protectively, corners suggesting where tools leaned or where light once entered. In some places, storage spaces remain recessed into stone, small and practical, revealing habits shaped by routine rather than ceremony. These were not public monuments, they were lived in structures, shaped by repetition and care. What lingers most strongly is the absence of disruption. There are no signs of panic pressed into the architecture, no hurried alterations, no barricades, no scars of conflict. The arrangement feels concluded, rather than interrupted, as if daily life simply loosened its grip and stepped away. Objects are largely gone, but the spaces that held them remain, unchanged enough to imagine order continuing just beyond reach. Silence dominates these neighborhoods, but it is not empty. It feels layered, carrying the memory of voices that once filled the streets at predictable times. Without sound, the layout itself communicates. Pathways reveal habits. Proximity reveals relationships. The distance between homes suggests familiarity, a closeness built from shared days rather than necessity. The city speaks through structure alone. Leaving such a place does not feel like exiting a ruin. It feels more like drifting away from something that continues without needing observation. The streets remain aligned, doorways remain open, foundations remain steady. Water occupies the space without altering its meaning. Daily life has withdrawn, yet the neighborhood persists, holding its shape patiently, allowing time to pass without insisting on an ending. At the edge of the Nile Delta, where river water once met the open Mediterranean, stood a port city built for movement and exchange. Known to the ancient world as Thonis Heraclean, it functioned as a threshold, a place where ships slowed, cargo shifted hands, and cultures overlapped without friction. For centuries, its presence was recorded only in fragments of text, named in passing by travelers and officials, its physical reality fading as shorelines shifted and memory thinned. These written echoes endured long after the city itself slipped from sight. Scholars debated their accuracy, weighing myth against possibility. Without visible remains, the city hovered uncertainly between history and story, existing more securely on papyrus than in geography. The delta, restless and saturated, rearranged itself repeatedly, covering traces of stone beneath layers of sediment and water. What once lay at the surface settled quietly below, removed from everyday reference. When the city was finally rediscovered beneath the Mediterranean, it did not arrive as a ruin scattered by chance. Instead, it emerged with coherence. Temples stood where they had been built, aligned carefully within the city's plan. Colossal statues lay where processions once passed, their scale unchanged by submersion. Canals traced deliberate routes between districts, still shaping the flow of water above them. Even ships remained nearby. Some settled gently into the mud, their hulls preserved by the same environment that had hidden them. The preservation was not accidental. Thonis Heraclean rested on ground that had always carried water within it. The delta's soil, rich and productive, was also soft, composed of fine sediments deposited over thousands of years. As weight accumulated from buildings and monuments, the ground responded slowly. Saturated layers compacted, and foundations began to settle unevenly. The process did not announce itself through collapse. It expressed itself through quiet adjustment. Over time, rising water added its own pressure. Sea levels crept upward, and river channels shifted their balance between fresh and salt. The city's canals, once controlled and navigable, became conduits for encroaching water. Structures sank incrementally, not in isolation, but together, maintaining their relationships even as their elevation changed. Streets remained streets, temples remained temples, only their context transformed. Because the descent was gradual, daily life had time to respond. Objects were removed, ceremonies relocated, movement redirected. What remains beneath the water reflects a city that withdrew rather than fell. The absence of widespread destruction suggests departure guided by recognition rather than panic. Stone endured after people left, held in place by sediment that settled like a closing hand. Today, the submerged city offers clarity through accumulation rather than exposure. Artifacts remain where they were last set down, protected by low oxygen and stable temperatures. Columns retain their carvings, Statues hold their expressions. The harbor infrastructure still outlines how trade once moved through the city, linking the Mediterranean to the river that fed Egypt's interior. Thonis Heracleion stands as evidence of how cities can disappear without being erased. It shows how geography and time collaborate, not through sudden endings, but through steady negotiation. Beneath the water, the city continues to occupy its space, no longer active, yet not dismantled. Its recovery does not restore it to use, but to understanding, offering a measured glimpse of a port that once regulated movement, wealth, and belief at the meeting point of river and sea. Cities built near water rest on an agreement made quietly with the ground beneath them. At first, the soil feels dependable, firm enough to accept weight and shape. Layers of sediment compress gently under stone foundations, holding their form through seasons and generations. In river deltas and coastal plains, this ground is fed continuously by water, refreshed by floods that deposit new material, renewing the surface while subtly altering what lies below. As time passes, water seeps deeper, filling the tiny spaces between grains of sand and silt. These grains do not dissolve or vanish. Instead, they become buoyed, separated by moisture that changes how they interact. Dry soil grips itself through friction, each particle leaning against another. Saturated soil loses that grip. Weight no longer transfers cleanly downward, it disperses sideways, asking the ground to behave like a fluid while still pretending to be solid. Buildings respond first with subtle shifts. Floors tilt slightly, walls accept hairline cracks that do not yet concern their occupants. Doors stick where they once swung freely. These changes feel small, manageable, easily repaired. The city continues to function above, unaware that its foundation has begun negotiating with physics rather than resisting it. In deltas, vulnerability deepens because the ground is young. Layers of sediment have not had time to settle fully, stacked by rivers that never stop delivering material. Fresh deposits compress slowly under their own weight, even without human construction pressing down. Add stone, monuments, and infrastructure, and the process accelerates. The land sinks not because it is weak, but because it is still in motion. Earthquakes introduce another quiet influence. Even when distant or moderate, their vibrations pass through saturated ground differently than through dry rock. Shaking allows water trapped between grains to move suddenly, loosening contact further. In moments, soil can behave less like earth and more like thick suspension. When this happens repeatedly over centuries, each tremor nudges the ground closer to giving way, lowering it by increments too small to notice individually. What results is not collapse, but adjustment. Structures descend together. Streets remain level relative to one another, even as their elevation changes. Harbors grow deeper without being dredged. Water reaches places it did not before, lingering longer each year. The city adapts by raising walkways, reinforcing walls, extending canals. These responses delay recognition rather than prevent the outcome. Because this process unfolds without violence, it leaves little visible record of distress. There are no burn layers, no piles of rubble, no scattered debris. Life continues as usual, even as the baseline shifts downward. Generation by generation, the city learns new routines that account for higher water and softer ground, never realizing how far the negotiation has progressed. Eventually, adaptation yields to resignation. The cost of maintenance outweighs use. Water enters structures more often than it retreats. Foundations settle unevenly enough to strain repairs. At this point, withdrawal feels practical rather than forced. People leave behind stone that no longer serves them, trusting that it will remain where they set it. When cities sink this way, they do not advertise their passing. They settle into the landscape as quietly as they once rose from it. Water replaces air in familiar spaces, sediment seals surfaces, and the ground continues its slow work beneath. The absence of drama is what allows preservation. With no moment of destruction to scatter materials, the city remains intact, lowered carefully into a new element, where its shape persists long after its purpose has faded. Off the coast of present day Israel, beneath shallow coastal waters, rests Atlit Yam, a settlement so old that it predates written memory. Unlike later cities shaped by trade and monument, this village reflects a quieter relationship with the world, one measured by routine rather than record. Its age stretches beyond 9,000 years, into a time when the coastline itself stood farther seaward, and the sea had not yet claimed the land it now covers. The remains of Atlit Yam sit calmly on the seabed, arranged with an order that reveals intention rather than chance. Stone houses form small clusters, their walls low but deliberate, placed to shelter daily life from wind and sun. Paths between them suggest repeated movement, the kind shaped by habit rather than planning. Wells remain in place, carefully lined with stone, marking dependable access to fresh water at a time when survival depended entirely on proximity and consistency. Nearby, graves rest within the village boundary, folding remembrance into everyday space without separation. What survives here is not ceremony, but use. Tools lie where work once happened. Grinding stones remain where food was prepared. The layout offers evidence of cooperation, of shared labor and shared expectation. These were people who returned to the same places day after day, measuring time through seasons and tides rather than calendars. Their village was shaped by immediate needs, not permanence, yet its simplicity allowed it to endure beyond its makers. The sea preserved Atlit Yam gently. Sediment settled slowly over stone, sealing surfaces from erosion and disturbance. Low oxygen conditions limited decay, allowing organic traces to linger longer than they ever would on land. Because the village was abandoned gradually, not destroyed, its structure remained undisturbed. There are no signs of violence or haste pressed into the ground. Life here appears to have loosened its hold rather than been torn away. This quiet withdrawal aligns with the wider changes unfolding at the time. As the last ice age released its hold on the planet, melting ice sheets added water to the oceans. Coastlines shifted inland over generations, not through sudden floods, but through steady advance. What had once been safe ground became seasonally wet, then persistently damp. Wells drew salt instead of fresh water. Paths softened underfoot. Adaptation followed for as long as it could, until staying required more effort than leaving. Atlit Yam stands as evidence of this long patience. The village shows how early communities responded to environmental change without drama. They did not record their departure, but their absence speaks clearly. Objects left behind suggest order, not collapse. The sea entered spaces that had already emptied, occupying them without resistance. Stone walls held their shape, wells remained aligned, and the village slipped quietly into a new state of rest. Because Atlit Yam belongs to a world before writing, its story must be read through placement and material rather than words. Each structure acts as a sentence formed in stone. Together, they describe a way of living grounded in repetition and awareness, shaped by a landscape that felt stable until it no longer was. The village does not mark an end. It marks a transition, one of the earliest recorded moments when rising seas gently redirected human life. Now, beneath the water, Atlit Yam remains intact, not as a monument, but as a memory preserved by geography. Its stones continue to outline routines long concluded, offering a quiet record of daily life from a time when history had not yet learned to write itself down. As the last ice age loosened its hold on the planet, the change arrived without spectacle. Vast ice sheets that had pressed continents flat for thousands of years began to thin, then withdraw, releasing water slowly into the global ocean. The process did not rush. It unfolded at a pace measured in centuries, almost imperceptible within a single human lifetime. Yet across the world, the sea began to respond, rising not in waves of catastrophe, but in steady increments that quietly redrew the margins of land. Coastlines adjusted first, beaches narrowed, then vanished. Tidal flats lengthened, holding water longer each year before releasing it again. What had once dried completely at low tide remained damp, then submerged. Rivers met the sea farther inland, their mouths rearranged into new shapes. These shifts did not announce themselves as endings. They felt like seasonal variation, subtle enough to be absorbed into routine. Human settlements followed the same rhythm. Villages near the shore adapted by moving small distances at first, building slightly higher, choosing ground that felt unchanged. Paths were rerouted, wells were abandoned and redug. Fields shifted inland by margins, so narrow they barely registered as loss. Each generation inherited a coastline that appeared familiar, even as it continued to recede. This pattern repeated itself again and again. A settlement would remain viable for decades, sometimes centuries, before the balance tipped gently out of reach. Saltwater crept into freshwater sources. Storms reached farther than before. Ground softened under structures that had once stood firm. When adjustment became labor rather than habit, people relocated, carrying skills, tools, and memory with them. What they left behind was not ruined, only no longer useful. Because this movement was gradual, it rarely entered record or legend. There were no singular moments to preserve, no disasters to define the change. Land disappeared quietly, absorbed into the ocean without resistance. Entire stretches of coast slipped below the surface without ever being named as lost. The absence of urgency allowed the process to pass without attention, even as its cumulative effect reshaped continents. Archaeological traces reflect this patience. Layers of occupation appear stacked inland like rings of growth, each one marking a pause before retreat. Houses give way to newer foundations nearby. Tools travel with people, while stone and earth remain. The sea accepts what is left without scattering it, covering surfaces slowly with sediment that seals rather than destroys. In many places, this gentleness is what preserved evidence of early life so clearly. The ocean's advance after the Ice Age did not seek to erase. It simply expanded into space that had become available again. Water followed gravity and volume, responding to changes far beyond the horizon. From a geological perspective, the movement was balanced and expected. Ice melted, water redistributed, coastlines adjusted. Human presence adapted within that larger motion, flexible enough to endure without marking the change as conflict. Over time, the scale becomes clear. What feels like stability within a generation reveals itself as migration across many. Settlements did not fall into the sea so much as allow the sea to occupy what they no longer claimed. Memory stepped inland with people, while stone remained behind to trace where the boundary once lay. This slow advance left no singular story, only a pattern repeated across the world. Land yielded quietly. Water filled the space. Life adjusted, then adjusted again. And beneath the modern shoreline, earlier worlds settled into stillness, preserved not by sudden burial, but by the patience of an ocean that moved forward without ever needing to announce its arrival. Off India's western shore, beyond the shifting line where land meets the Arabian Sea, lie traces of a city that endured uncertainty more than once. Dwarka occupies a coastline shaped by repetition, where settlement and retreat unfolded not as a single event, but as a cycle measured across long spans of time. Its story is not one of sudden disappearance, but of persistence tested again and again by water that returned with quiet insistence. Archaeological remains discovered offshore reveal stone structures arranged with intention. Walls run straight and purposeful, meeting at right angles rather than scattering randomly. Foundations suggest buildings designed to stand, not temporary shelters, but spaces meant for continuity. Nearby, large stone anchors rest on the seafloor, their weight and form indicating a harbor once active with vessels. These elements point to a functioning coastal city, one integrated into maritime movement rather than isolated by it. What distinguishes Dwarka is not simply that it lies underwater, but that evidence suggests it was rebuilt more than once. Layers of stone appear stacked, earlier structures overlaid by later construction. This pattern hints at repeated flooding events that altered the coastline without fully ending habitation. Rather than abandon the site immediately, builders returned, reinforcing and adapting, placing new foundations atop old ones, trusting that the balance might hold again. The sea here did not behave as a single force. Storm surges arrived at intervals. Shorelines shifted subtly between calm periods. Water entered low areas, retreated, then returned farther inland. Each event reshaped the boundary between city and ocean by degrees. Dwarka responded through repair rather than retreat, suggesting a community accustomed to negotiation with its environment. The presence of anchors implies that trade continued despite these disruptions, reinforcing the city's importance even as conditions grew more uncertain. Scientific interpretation of Dwarka proceeds carefully, without myth or excess. The underwater structures are real, mapped and measured, but they do not claim a singular narrative of catastrophe. Instead, they reflect complexity. Natural processes such as coastal erosion, sediment movement, and tectonic activity each contributed gradually. No single cause explains the city's fate. Its submergence appears to have been cumulative, shaped by repeated stress rather than one decisive moment. This gradual pressure allowed life to adjust incrementally. When water damaged structures, repairs followed. When flooding became more frequent, construction shifted. The city's layout suggests adaptation, layered over time, not abandonment driven by fear. Eventually, however, repetition altered the cost of staying. Repairs lost their permanence. The shoreline's instability made confidence harder to sustain. Withdrawal, when it came, was not an escape, but a recognition that the negotiation had ended. What remains beneath the water preserves this long dialogue with the sea. Stone does not lie scattered, but placed. Anchors rest where they were last used, not discarded in haste. There is no single horizon of destruction pressed into the record. Instead, the evidence reflects endurance, rebuilding, and eventual release. Dwarka's story is written across layers rather than moments. In this way, the city stands apart from places lost quietly or suddenly. It was tested repeatedly, each time answering the sea with resilience. Its final submergence does not erase those efforts. The structures resting offshore hold the memory of return as much as departure. Dwarka did not vanish once. It faded through persistence, leaving behind a record of how long people were willing to rebuild before accepting that the shoreline they trusted had changed for good. Long after rising seas had redrawn coastlines and softened foundations, storms arrived as punctuation rather than cause. They did not introduce change so much as hasten what was already underway. Along vulnerable shores, weather carried more force than memory could hold, delivering moments of intensity that settled quietly into longer patterns of retreat. Wind and water acted together, compressing years of gradual weakening into nights that left unmistakable marks. Ancient storm surges moved differently from the steady advance of the sea. They gathered momentum across open water, pushing height and energy toward land in concentrated bursts. Harbors that had adjusted patiently to higher tides found themselves overwhelmed all at once. Protective walls overtopped, mooring stones were pulled loose. Channels carved deeper paths through sediment already loosened by saturation. When the water withdrew, it left rearrangement behind, not devastation, but imbalance. In some regions, seismic movement added another dimension. Underwater earthquakes displaced volumes of water rapidly, sending long waves toward shorelines unprepared for their reach. These tsunamis did not announce themselves with sound. They arrived as rising walls that lifted boats into streets and carried heavy objects far beyond their intended places. Even when the waves passed quickly, the effect lingered. Foundations weakened further, ground subsided unevenly. Structures that had survived centuries of calm could not always recover from a single, concentrated event. Cities responded first by repairing what had been damaged. Harbors were cleared, walls reinforced, silt was removed where possible. These efforts restored function but consumed energy that had once been invested elsewhere. Each storm demanded more work than the last, as damage accumulated faster than it could be undone. What had once been routine maintenance became continuous recovery. Repeated storms altered daily expectations. Coastal residents learned to read the water more carefully, adjusting schedules, securing goods, retreating temporarily during seasons of risk. Over time, these precautions revealed a deeper truth. Temporary withdrawal became a recurring necessity rather than an exception. When spaces required evacuation regularly, their role within the city diminished. Markets shifted inland, storage moved higher, harbors lost reliability, and with it, their economic gravity. The decision to leave did not follow a single storm. It followed the erosion of confidence. Each surge left behind repairs that held less firmly. Each wave removed another layer of sediment that had once supported walls. Over generations, these events compressed the timeline of abandonment. What might have taken centuries under calm conditions unfolded more quickly when storms intervened. Importantly, the physical record reflects this acceleration without dramatization. Archaeological layers show repair atop repair, reinforcement over reinforcement. There is rarely a distinct horizon of destruction. Instead, there are signs of stress, adaptations layered tightly together, indicating that change outpaced adjustment. Objects are not scattered chaotically. They remain placed, suggesting withdrawal after damage rather than flight during crisis. Storms finished what water began by clarifying limits. They exposed weaknesses already present, transforming gradual loss into something harder to ignore. Where the sea had negotiated patiently, storms forced acknowledgement. Cities built for permanence faced forces that emphasized motion, reminding inhabitants that stability along the coast was conditional. When abandonment followed, it carried an air of resolution rather than panic. Communities relocated with knowledge gained through repetition. They left behind structures that no longer served their rhythm of life. The water reclaimed spaces already emptied, filling them without resistance. In this way, storms acted as accelerants within a longer story. They did not rewrite the fate of coastal cities. They simply hastened the moment when staying required more effort than leaving. What remains beneath the water reflects this measured transition, shaped by endurance, interruption, and the final acceptance that the shoreline had moved beyond repair. Some cities did not end with smoke or violence. They did not leave behind ash, shattered walls, or hurried abandonment pressed into the ground. Instead, they faded in a way that leaves almost no punctuation in the archaeological record. Their disappearance is defined less by what is present than by what is missing. No burn layers separate occupation from absence. No weapons cluster where defenses failed. The silence of these places begins gently, without a clear moment of rupture. In such cities, the ground tells a restrained story. Floors remain clean of debris. Walls stand upright without signs of collapse. Streets show wear that ends gradually rather than abruptly, as though foot traffic simply thinned over time. Objects were removed deliberately, not dropped in haste. Storage spaces empty evenly. Doorways close nothing in. These details suggest departure, guided by routine, not fear. The absence of invasion marks these sites clearly. There are no foreign materials signaling conquest, no sudden changes in construction style imposed from elsewhere. Cultural continuity persists right up until the moment it no longer does. Pottery styles evolve naturally, then stop appearing. Repairs continue for a while, then become less frequent. Infrastructure receives attention until maintaining it no longer fits into daily life. The city does not resist an enemy, it outgrows its reason to stay. Gradual withdrawal reshapes space before it empties it. Neighborhoods thin unevenly. Some areas fall quiet while others remain occupied, creating pockets of activity separated by stillness. Public buildings lose prominence first. As gatherings disperse, markets shift location, then dissolve. Private homes persist longer, holding on to habit even when communal life has softened around them. Over time, occupancy contracts inward, leaving outer edges dormant. This kind of ending rarely enters memory. Without drama, there is nothing to commemorate or warn against. Oral tradition moves on with the people who leave, carrying stories that focus on continuity rather than loss. What remains behind is not framed as tragedy, but as redundancy. The city becomes a place that no longer fits the present, quietly released from use. Environmental pressures often sit beneath these endings without demanding attention. Water arrives a little more often, soil grows less reliable. Trade shifts, routes slowly. Resources remain available, but no longer conveniently placed. Each change feels manageable on its own. Together, they encourage relocation rather than resistance. Leaving becomes the most practical choice, not a desperate one. Because these cities were not destroyed, they are often better preserved. Walls remain aligned, foundations hold their shape. In some cases, water later covers them gently, sealing surfaces instead of breaking them apart. Sediment settles evenly, time slows. The lack of disturbance allows these places to persist materially long after they stop existing socially. What defines these quiet endings is restraint. There is no single layer to point to, no moment to excavate and label as the end. Instead, the transition from presence to absence stretches thinly across years and generations. The city fades like a sound lowering in volume rather than cutting off. It leaves behind coherence without conclusion. Such sites remind us that abandonment does not require catastrophe. Human movement often follows comfort and opportunity more closely than survival alone. When staying requires effort without return, leaving can feel natural. These cities reflect that instinct. They did not fall. They simply loosened their hold on people, allowing life to continue elsewhere while stone and earth remained, holding shape without insisting on remembrance. Ports once marked the meeting place between motion and exchange. Stone docks extended into sheltered water, shaped carefully to receive hulls heavy with cargo and expectation. Harbor walls calmed waves, creating spaces where arrival felt predictable and departure felt planned. These structures were built with endurance in mind, layered stone upon stone, confident that the water they contained would remain cooperative. For generations, they held. As conditions shifted, these edges of commerce became points of strain. Rising water reached higher against walls never designed for constant immersion. Sediment accumulated where currents slowed, reshaping basins that had once stayed clear through routine use. Maintenance continued for a time, clearing channels and reinforcing surfaces, but the balance had begun to tip. Harbors rely on precision. Even small changes in depth or current alter their usefulness. When water overcame that precision, docks lost their role gradually. A pier that could no longer remain dry at low tide became unsafe, then unnecessary. Loading moved elsewhere. Repair schedules lengthened. Ships lingered farther offshore, waiting for tides that no longer aligned with routine. Each delay weakened the rhythm that trade depended upon. Some vessels never left. Ships sank at their moorings or just beyond harbor entrances, settling into mud rather than breaking apart. Their cargoes remained where they fell, sealed beneath silt that protected wood and metal from decay. These wrecks were not casualties of storms or conflict alone. Many represent moments when navigation faltered just enough, when depth changed by a margin too small to anticipate. Over time, harbors accumulated these silent anchors, reminders of thresholds that no longer functioned. As ports failed, trade routes unraveled quietly. Waterways that once linked inland producers to distant markets became unreliable. Goods moved more slowly, at greater cost, or not at all. Settlements that had thrived on exchange found themselves isolated without being besieged. Economic life contracted inward, then relocated entirely. The sea, which had once enabled connection, now interrupted it. This disconnection unfolded without ceremony. There were no proclamations marking the end of a harbor's usefulness. Instead, boats arrived less often. Repairs were postponed. Skilled labor moved elsewhere, following opportunity rather than loss. Stone remained, but activity did not. The port became an architectural shape without purpose, waiting for water to occupy the space it once controlled. Eventually, the sea completed the transition. Docks submerged fully, harbor walls became artificial reefs, collecting life rather than vessels. Channels filled, smoothing sharp edges into slopes of sediment. What had been a threshold between worlds settled into the seafloor, indistinguishable from natural formations to anyone passing above. Underwater, these ports remain legible. Stone blocks still outline basins, mooring points remain embedded in rock. Ships rest where they last functioned, aligned with routes that once mattered. Their preservation reflects a lack of disturbance. When trade ceased, activity stopped abruptly enough to leave structures intact, but gently enough to avoid destruction. Water ended economic lifelines not through force, but through persistence. As harbors slipped below usable depth, the systems they supported dissolved. Ports do not survive without trade, and trade does not survive without reliable access. Once that relationship breaks, movement reorganizes elsewhere. Today, these submerged ports form quiet records of transition. They show how economies anchored to water can be reshaped by the same element that sustained them. Stone and timber endure beneath the sea, holding the outlines of commerce long after exchange itself has moved on, leaving behind spaces that remember motion without requiring it to return. Long before cities were given names and histories were fixed in text, people gathered in places shaped by water, soil, and routine. These settlements left no inscriptions to declare who lived there or why they chose that ground. Their identities dissolved as language moved on with the living. What remains is material, arranged quietly, offering evidence without explanation. These prehistoric cities often appear first as patterns rather than structures. Lines of stone suggest boundaries once understood instinctively. Circles mark repeated use, places where fires burned and cooled countless times. Post holes trace the rhythm of shelter, rebuilt as materials weathered and seasons returned. The absence of writing shifts attention toward arrangement. The land itself becomes the page. Tools provide another layer of voice. Stone blades shaped for specific tasks reveal habits refined through repetition. Grinding stones worn smooth indicate daily preparation, not ceremonial display. Fishing weights and hunting points lie close to where they were last used, suggesting work conducted near home rather than staged elsewhere. These objects do not describe beliefs or names. They describe movement, effort, and care. Layouts speak through proximity. Homes cluster close enough to imply cooperation, yet space to allow privacy. Storage pits appear where access mattered, not where symmetry pleased the eye. Pathways curve gently between structures, following terrain rather than imposing order upon it. This architecture reflects attention rather than authority, a city shaped by negotiation with environment rather than command. What makes these settlements difficult to grasp is not their simplicity, but their familiarity. They resemble the earliest versions of patterns that persist today: living near water, sharing labor, returning to the same places each day. Without writing, these cities relied on memory carried through action. When people left, that memory departed with them, leaving stone and soil to hold the outline. Time erased names efficiently. Languages changed. Groups dispersed. Stories folded into others until origin blurred. Yet the physical record resisted this erasure. Stone remains patient. It does not reinterpret itself. When left undisturbed, it preserves the exact position where a hand last placed it. In this way, lives lost to memory remain visible without being remembered. Archaeology becomes the only voice capable of translating this silence. It does not recover individual identities, it reconstructs relationships. Wear patterns reveal how often a tool met resistance. Soil layers show where water lingered or receded. Carbon traces fix moments in time without attaching them to events. Each technique adds texture, not narrative, allowing the settlement to speak in its own restrained language. These cities did not vanish suddenly. Many were left gradually as environments shifted or resources changed. Without writing, there is no record of decision. Only absence marks the end of use. Structures stop being maintained. Tools remain where replacement ceased. The settlement rests, unclaimed by successors who left marks elsewhere. What emerges is a different understanding of loss. These cities are not tragedies remembered through story. They are continuities interrupted gently. Their erasure from memory did not remove their existence. It simply removed the words that once pointed to them. Stone remained, waiting for observation rather than remembrance. In the quiet presence of these prehistoric settlements, scale expands. Human history stretches beyond recorded beginnings into lives lived competently without documentation. These cities remind us that writing is not the measure of significance. Long before history learned to write itself down, people built places worth returning to, shaped routines worth preserving, and left behind cities that still speak, patiently, through form alone. When cities slip beneath the sea, they enter a different relationship with time. On land, abandonment invites exposure. Wind scours surfaces, rain dissolves mortar. Plants split stone as roots search for space. Temperature swings expand and contract materials until they fracture. What is left unguarded is slowly pulled apart, repurposed by weather and life, until outlines soften into suggestion. Underwater, those forces change character. Oxygen, so abundant above the surface, becomes limited beneath layers of water and sediment. Without it, many of the processes that drive decay slow dramatically. Metals corrode less aggressively. Organic material breaks down at a gentler pace. Wood, which would rot quickly in open air, can persist for centuries once sealed away from circulation. The sea does not remove time, it alters how time behaves. Erosion also quiets itself. Waves move powerfully at the surface, but their energy dissipates with depth. Beneath calm coastal waters, currents become predictable, often slow enough to allow fine particles to settle undisturbed. Sediment drifts downward, covering structures evenly rather than tearing at them. This blanket smooths sharp edges and fills open spaces, locking walls, floors, and objects into place. What land would scatter, the sea holds together. Temperature plays its part as well. Beneath the waterline, conditions fluctuate far less than they do above ground. Days do not heat stone and nights do not cool it rapidly. Seasons lose their extremes. This stability reduces stress on materials, allowing structures to retain their shape without constant expansion and contraction. In this calm thermal environment, deterioration proceeds without urgency. Over time, sediment becomes a form of preservation rather than burial. Layers accumulate slowly, sealing surfaces from further interaction. Streets are covered gently rather than crushed. Doorways fill without collapsing. Objects remain where they were last set down, pressed into a record that does not rearrange itself. The city becomes enclosed within its own stillness, held at a specific moment without being asked to endure change. This process creates an unusual form of survival. Cities beneath the sea are not restored to life, but they are not erased either. Their last configuration remains readable. Walls retain height. Plans remain intelligible. Entire neighborhoods can persist with their relationships intact. The absence of disturbance becomes more important than strength. On land, reuse accelerates loss. Stone is pulled from abandoned buildings to create new ones. Paths become quarries. Memory encourages transformation. Underwater, reuse rarely occurs. Access is limited. Effort outweighs reward. Structures remain where they fell out of use, protected not by intention, but by inconvenience. The sea isolates what land would recycle. In this environment, time slows into layers rather than motion. Instead of wearing away, history accumulates. Each deposit of sediment adds another page without erasing the one beneath it. The result is not stagnation, but patience. Cities are held quietly, allowed to exist without being asked to perform or adapt. This is why so many submerged cities appear frozen rather than ruined. The sea does not preserve through care, it preserves through consistency. Low oxygen, gentle currents, and stable temperatures combine to create a setting where disruption is rare. Beneath that calm surface, stone remains where it was placed, waiting without urgency. What land destroys through exposure, the sea shelters through restraint. Cities sink into a state where decay loses its momentum, replaced by stillness. Beneath layers of water and sediment, time continues to pass, but it passes softly, allowing human spaces to remain legible long after their voices have faded away. Many submerged cities return to awareness without intention. Their rediscovery did not begin with maps or research vessels, but with interruption. A fishing net pulled taut where open water was expected. A diver's light caught an edge that refused to be natural. These moments arrived quietly, without ceremony, revealing that the seafloor held forms that did not belong to geology alone. Along familiar routes, fishermen learned to recognize places where nets tore repeatedly. At first, these spots were avoided, blamed on careless debris or difficult ground. Over time, patterns emerged. Stone caught in mesh bore straight edges, anchors wedged where no reef should rise. These accidental encounters marked locations long submerged, their presence made known not through visibility, but resistance. Divers encountered similar surprises. Swimming over what appeared to be empty terrain, they found walls where sand should lie smooth. Courses of stone ran parallel without erosion rounding their edges. Openings appeared where water flowed differently, channels shaped not by current, but by plan. These discoveries felt less like finding something new and more like realizing something had always been there, simply unnoticed. As reports accumulated, technology followed curiosity. Sonar surveys traced the seafloor using sound, translating echoes into image. In these ghostly maps, natural formations appeared organic and irregular, while human structures revealed themselves through alignment. Right angles emerged beneath waves. Straight lines crossed spaces too deliberately to be accidental. Grids formed where sediment should have softened every boundary. Geometry, patient and precise, betrayed the presence of intention. What makes these discoveries remarkable is their unpredictability. Many were found far from expected locations, in waters assumed to be empty or too altered for preservation. Storms shifted sand just enough to reveal stone. Currents cleared surfaces briefly before covering them again. Each reveal was temporary, a momentary lifting of the veil rather than a permanent unveiling. Because chance guided these encounters, interpretation followed carefully. Accidental discovery invites caution. A wall might be natural until proven otherwise. A straight line could still belong to chance. Archaeology moved slowly, verifying through repetition, mapping, and context. What began as interruption grew into understanding through patience rather than excitement. This process highlights how much remains unseen. The ocean does not display its archive openly. It requires disturbance, slight and often unintended, to signal what rests below. Even then, it offers only fragments at first. A single stone leads to another. A line suggests a boundary. Gradually, a city takes shape where none was expected. Accident plays a quiet role in history. It bypasses assumptions and returns attention to places overlooked by intention. These discoveries did not arise from targeted searching, but from everyday interaction with the sea. Work interrupted, movement diverted, tools snagged. In each case, routine opened a door that planning had not. Once identified, these sites transformed from obstacles into records. Fishermen adjusted routes. Divers returned with documentation. Sonar maps guided careful exploration. What began as nuisance became knowledge, not because the ocean offered it freely, but because people noticed what did not belong. These moments remind us that the past does not always announce itself. It waits within ordinary spaces, revealed through friction rather than invitation. Beneath routes traveled daily, entire histories rest intact, held by water and sediment. Chance encounters bridge the distance between absence and awareness, allowing submerged cities to re enter, understanding not through spectacle, but through quiet interruption that turns routine into revelation. Across many continental shelves, the presence of submerged cities is no longer a matter of discovery, but of acknowledgement. Their outlines exist in data rather than stone, traced by sonar that sweeps broad arcs across the seafloor. These surveys reveal shapes that break the expected language of nature. Long, straight edges appear where currents should curve. Rectangular enclosures sit where randomness should dominate. The signal is clear enough to recognize intention, yet distant enough to resist touch. These cities exist as impressions rather than places. Sonar maps flatten depth into contour, translating solid walls into gradients of color and shadow. Streets become lines of difference. Courtyards become voids framed by suggestion. From these images, researchers can measure scale and alignment, estimating size and orientation without ever disturbing a single stone. Knowledge arrives abstracted, filtered through instrumentation rather than immersion. Excavation rarely follows immediately. The reasons are not mysterious, but practical. Submerged heritage exists within modern borders, regulated by laws that balance preservation, ownership, and responsibility. Some sites lie in contested waters. Others rest beneath shipping lanes or protected ecosystems. Permission becomes layered, requiring agreement across institutions that do not move quickly. The sea waits while paperwork accumulates. Cost adds another dimension. Underwater archaeology demands equipment, vessels, and trained teams capable of operating in environments where time is limited and error is costly. Each descent consumes resources that must be justified carefully. When a site can be mapped without excavation, restraint often prevails. Knowing where a city rests does not obligate immediate entry into it. This creates a quiet distinction between knowing and understanding. Sonar confirms existence. It establishes position, size, and form. Understanding, however, requires intimacy. It asks how spaces connect, how materials weathered, how people moved through rooms rather than across outlines. Until excavation occurs, these cities remain legible only in part, their stories compressed into geometry. Science accepts this distance with discipline. Patience becomes a method rather than a delay. By waiting, researchers allow technology to improve, methods to refine, and questions to sharpen. A city left untouched today may yield more tomorrow when tools can preserve rather than disturb. In underwater contexts, preservation often means leaving things exactly as they are. There is also respect in restraint. Excavation is an act of change. It alters what it reveals. Sediment once lifted cannot be replaced perfectly. Objects once exposed re-enter environments they were protected from. For some sites, remaining unseen is a form of survival. Understanding grows through observation rather than intervention. As years pass, archives fill with mapped outlines, cataloged coordinates, and annotated images. These records form a quiet census of the unseen. They testify to how much lies beyond immediate reach, not lost, but waiting. Each mapped city becomes a promise held in reserve, acknowledged but not consumed. This approach reshapes the relationship between curiosity and action. Instead of chasing every signal, science learns to listen longer. It distinguishes urgency from importance. The difference matters beneath the sea, where haste can erase what patience preserves. In this way, unexcavated cities occupy a unique space within human knowledge. They are present without being familiar, known without being entered. Their outlines remain steady on maps while their details sleep undisturbed. Science stands at their edge, not in frustration, but in acceptance, understanding that some knowledge deepens best when it is allowed to mature slowly, resting beneath the water until the moment to meet it arrives naturally. Rivers appear steady when observed across a lifetime. They follow familiar bends, return each season with predictable rise and fall, and anchor cities that learn their moods. For generations, ports formed where fresh water met movement, where boats could travel inland and return carrying goods, people, and stories. The river's presence felt permanent, reliable enough to build upon without hesitation. Yet rivers are never fixed. Beneath their surface, they negotiate constantly with gravity, sediment, and slope. Each flood carries material downstream, redistributing sand and silt grain by grain. Over years, channels widen on one bank and narrow on another. Meanders drift sideways. What looks like a gentle curve slowly sharpens, then cuts itself off, redirecting flow into a new path. The shift rarely announces itself in a single moment. It unfolds as adjustment layered upon adjustment. When a river begins to favor a new course, cities feel the change before they fully understand it. Water reaches docks less consistently. Channels that once remained deep begin to fill. Boats scrape bottom where they once passed freely. Maintenance increases, dredging becomes routine, and structures stretch farther out in search of reliable depth. These responses work for a time, extending usefulness without restoring certainty. Eventually, the river pulls away. Its main flow settles elsewhere, leaving behind a secondary channel that carries less water and more sediment. Ports built to receive movement find themselves edged by stagnation. Fresh water becomes harder to access as flow weakens or shifts beyond reach. Trade slows, not because demand disappears, but because connection does. Silt plays a quiet but decisive role. Without strong current to carry it onward, sediment settles into harbors and basins, lifting the riverbed steadily upward. What was once navigable becomes shallow, then impassable. Flooding grows more frequent as water spreads sideways rather than moving efficiently downstream. The city that depended on precise balance between depth and flow finds itself managing excess instead of access. These changes reshape daily life. Merchants reroute, fishermen follow the water elsewhere. Infrastructure loses relevance piece by piece. A city may remain physically intact while its function dissolves. Freshwater sources grow unreliable. Wells require deeper digging or replacement. Without regular trade, economic rhythms soften, then reorganize beyond the river's reach. Importantly, these transformations do not feel like disaster while they are happening. A river changing course does not destroy walls or scatter homes. It simply removes itself from places that were built around it. The city is left standing, but disconnected, holding structures that point toward a flow that no longer arrives. In some cases, water returns in excess rather than absence. Abandoned channels flood irregularly during heavy rains, spreading across ground that no longer drains efficiently. Low-lying areas remain wet longer each year. Foundations soften, streets lose firmness. The city adapts again, raising pathways, shifting use, consolidating population. Over time, however, adaptation yields diminishing returns. Archaeological traces reveal this slow unraveling. Layers show continued occupation alongside failing infrastructure. Harbors narrow, river facing buildings lose prominence, repairs cluster unevenly. There is no horizon marking collapse, only a gradual loosening of connection between place and purpose. Geography, in these cases, reshapes civilization without intent. Rivers pursue efficiency, not loyalty. They follow gradients rather than history. Cities that once thrived by aligning themselves with water find themselves misaligned when the water chooses differently. When abandonment finally occurs, it reflects adjustment rather than defeat. People move closer to the river's new course or toward other routes entirely. What remains behind is a city shaped for a flow that passed on. Stone and earth preserve the outline of that relationship, marking where water once arrived daily before choosing another way forward. When cities were left behind, objects became the quiet witnesses of departure. Not monuments or inscriptions, but the ordinary things that once filled hands and shelves remained to mark the moment when daily life loosened its grip. Pottery rests where it was last used, bowls stacked neatly or set aside after meals that would not be repeated. Tools lie close to workspaces, positioned as if they might still be needed tomorrow. These items do not speak of chaos, they speak of routine interrupted gently. Archaeologists often find these spaces arranged rather than abandoned. Storage jars sit empty, cleaned before being left behind. Hearths show their final use without signs of haste. Broken objects were sometimes removed entirely, while intact ones stayed. This pattern suggests choice. People took what mattered most to them, what could travel easily, what retained value beyond place. What remained was useful only where it was, bound to spaces that could no longer support life. The distribution of objects reveals priorities shaped by necessity. Personal items, clothing, portable tools, and materials essential for work tend to vanish first. Heavier goods remain. Large vessels stay where they were made to stand. Grinding stones sink into floors that were never meant to move. Architectural elements remain untouched, built into the city itself. What could not be carried was not destroyed, it was simply left. This kind of departure leaves behind a recognizable calm. There is no scattering of belongings, no overlap of spaces that suggests confusion. Rooms retain their intended function even after use has ended. Kitchens remain kitchens. Workshops remain workshops. The order of the city persists after the people are gone, frozen in arrangement rather than damaged by loss. Objects also reveal what was impossible to anticipate. Some items remain in ways that suggest expectation of return. Doors were not dismantled. Storage spaces were not emptied completely. Certain tools stayed near entrances, as though their owners assumed they would be retrieved. These details suggest that leaving was not always understood as final. The boundary between temporary withdrawal and permanent departure was often unclear. Over time, these objects became part of the city's preservation. When water arrived, pottery settled where it stood, protected by sediment that filled spaces without rearranging them. Organic materials disappeared slowly, leaving impressions behind. Metal corroded gently, retaining shape even as it changed substance. The absence of disturbance allowed placement to remain readable long after use had ended. The contrast between what was taken and what was left behind deepens the sense of transition. People carried skills, knowledge, and memory with them. Those elements do not appear in the archaeological record. What remains instead is weight, material, and scale. The city keeps what was hardest to move, not what was most meaningful. Meaning traveled elsewhere, embedded in people rather than objects. These leftovers do not imply poverty or neglect. They reflect the limits of movement. Boats and paths could not carry everything. Choices were constrained by distance, capacity, and time. Objects left behind were not abandoned because they lacked worth. They were abandoned because the city itself could no longer accompany its inhabitants. In this way, household items become markers of decision rather than loss. They show how departure unfolded without collapse, guided by practicality rather than urgency. Each object rests where it last belonged, neither hidden nor discarded. Together, they form a still life of leaving, a portrait of daily existence paused gently at the moment when people stepped away, allowing the city to hold what they could not bring with them. When homes slip beneath the water, they do not vanish abruptly. They remain where they were built, holding shape and proportion, yet emptied of the sounds that once defined them. Walls continue to enclose space. Doorways still mark passage. Rooms retain their size and balance. What disappears is not structure, but presence. In these submerged homes, silence behaves differently. It is not the absence that follows catastrophe, but a sustained stillness that replaces routine. Kitchens hold no clatter. Sleeping spaces do not soften with breath. Courtyards no longer gather voices at the beginning and end of days. The architecture remains tuned for life, yet life has withdrawn, leaving spaces calibrated for use that never returns. Streets extend outward from these homes with the same calm geometry they always possessed. They turn gently, they widen and narrow in expected places, yet no footsteps follow them now. The paths that once wore smooth under repeated passage hold their final texture, preserved by sediment and water. Movement has ended, but direction remains, pointing toward destinations that exist only in memory. This silence carries emotional weight without demanding attention. There is no sign of struggle pressed into walls, no marks of departure beyond absence itself. The calm suggests that leaving happened without force, yet the stillness that follows feels complete. Sound did not fade gradually here, it stopped arriving. Familiarity deepens the effect. These homes look understandable. Their scale matches the human body. Their proportions feel correct. One can recognize where light once entered, where objects would have rested, where people gathered. The spaces do not appear alien or distant. They appear close enough to reach, yet permanently separated by water. This distance changes how loss is perceived. Destruction invites reaction. Ruins command attention through damage. Submerged homes do neither. They remain intact, which allows the mind to imagine continuity rather than finality. That imagined continuity sharpens the absence. Life feels paused rather than ended, making the silence feel heavier. Water reinforces this quiet by sealing spaces gently. It fills rooms without disturbing their boundaries. It cushions corners and edges rather than breaking them. Sediment settles like dust that never needs sweeping. The environment preserves stillness instead of interrupting it. Time passes without leaving a visible mark, allowing absence to remain complete. These homes are unreachable not because they are hidden, but because they are held apart. The barrier is not collapse or ruin, but depth. Familiar spaces remain visible yet inaccessible, creating a distance that cannot be crossed without effort and equipment. This separation alters relationship rather than recognition. What once belonged to daily movement now exists beyond ordinary reach. The emotional silence of these places does not demand mourning. It offers quiet acknowledgement. The homes remain, neither inviting nor rejecting attention. They exist without expectation. Their loss is not framed by disaster, but by withdrawal. What was taken away was not the space itself, but the ability to inhabit it. Over time, this quiet becomes part of the environment. Marine life moves through rooms where people once paused. Light shifts across floors that held furniture. Water occupies every corner evenly, refusing to favor one space over another. The homes are no longer private, they have become neutral, part of the surrounding world. Yet the feeling lingers. These places were shaped for care, rest, and return. Their continued presence without those functions creates a stillness that feels complete. It is not loud enough to be grief, nor empty enough to be forgetfulness. It is a quiet kind of loss, preserved in full view, waiting without sound, allowing the absence itself to remain the final occupant. Exploring submerged cities requires a different kind of restraint than exploration on land. Beneath the water, every movement carries consequence. Sediment stirred once can take decades to resettle. A single exposed surface may begin changing the moment it meets oxygen and current. For this reason, underwater archaeology advances slowly, guided as much by what it avoids as by what it reveals. Excavation underwater is limited by time and condition. Divers operate within narrow windows, bound by depth, pressure, and safety. Each visit must be deliberate, measured, and reversible as much as possible. Removing material is not simply a matter of lifting it free. Once an object leaves its resting place, its context changes permanently. Relationships between structures, layers, and placement can never be fully restored. Because of this, preservation has become the guiding principle. Many sites are documented without being disturbed at all. Mapping, photography, and scanning allow researchers to record positions with precision while leaving stone, wood, and sediment untouched. Instead of collecting artifacts, science increasingly collects data. The city remains where it is, while understanding grows from careful observation rather than extraction. This approach reflects respect not only for materials, but for meaning. Submerged cities are not empty ruins waiting to be recovered. They are cultural landscapes shaped by history and preserved by circumstance. Removing objects may satisfy curiosity, but it also fragments the story those objects tell together. By allowing them to remain in place, the city retains coherence. In many cases, leaving a site undisturbed offers the best protection. Exposure increases vulnerability. Once sediment is removed, surfaces face erosion, biological growth, and chemical change. What was stable for centuries can begin to deteriorate within years. The decision not to excavate becomes an act of care rather than neglect. Technology supports this restraint. Remote operated vehicles observe without touch. High resolution sonar reveals layout without intrusion. Photogrammetry reconstructs three-dimensional models that can be studied repeatedly without returning to the site. These tools allow cities to remain underwater while still contributing to knowledge above the surface. There is also an ethical dimension to this patience. Submerged heritage often belongs to multiple communities at once. Descendants, nations, and cultures share stake in what lies below. Preserving a city in place avoids disputes over removal and ownership. It keeps the past accessible in principle, even if it remains physically distant. Letting cities remain untouched also acknowledges their current environment. Over time, many sites have become part of marine ecosystems. Fish move through streets. Coral grows along walls. These layers do not erase history, they add a new chapter. Responsible exploration recognizes this continuity rather than attempting to rewind it. Restraint does not mean absence of action, it means choosing moments carefully. Some excavations are necessary to answer specific questions or to rescue materials at risk. When they occur, they are small, controlled, and documented exhaustively. The goal is not recovery, but understanding, gained with the least possible disruption. This philosophy changes the pace of discovery. Progress unfolds slowly, often invisibly. A city may remain unexplored for decades after being identified, waiting for better methods or clearer purpose. In this waiting, science accepts that not all knowledge needs to be immediate. Respecting submerged heritage means accepting limits. It means allowing places to exist without being consumed by curiosity. These cities have already survived long transitions from land to sea. Their continued preservation depends on restraint equal to our interest. By exploring carefully, or sometimes not at all, we allow them to remain complete, resting quietly beneath the water, holding their stories intact without being asked to surrender them. As cities slipped from reach, memory adjusted before stone did. What remained visible from shore became story, shaped by distance and time rather than measurement. A harbor remembered as bustling grew grander with retelling. A skyline glimpsed beneath water became a vision rather than a plan. In this way, real places began to drift toward legend, not through invention, but through the absence of correction. Loss invites meaning. When a city vanishes without explanation, imagination fills the silence. Stories gather where records thin, arranging cause and consequence into forms that feel complete. The sea becomes intentional, the city becomes moral. What was once a sequence of environmental shifts condenses into a narrative of punishment, hubris, or divine will. These interpretations offer comfort through structure, even when they depart from fact. Myths form most easily around places that can no longer answer for themselves. When stone rests beyond reach, it cannot contradict metaphor. The distance allows symbolism to expand, turning geography into message. A submerged city becomes a warning. Its disappearance acquires purpose. Over generations, the details that do not serve the lesson fall away, leaving a streamlined tale that travels farther than evidence ever could. Yet legend often preserves a core of truth. Many stories remember location accurately. They recall proximity to water, trade, or sudden change. They retain names altered by language, places remembered through sound rather than spelling. In this way, myth does not invent from nothing. It reshapes fragments that once belonged to lived experience. Archaeology approaches these stories without rejection or acceptance. It listens without repeating. Symbols are set aside gently, not dismissed. While physical evidence takes precedence, stone is mapped. Layers are dated. Objects are placed within context that resists drama. This process does not aim to erase story, but to translate it into material terms. Separating symbolism from data requires patience. A legend may speak of sudden collapse, while the ground records centuries of adjustment. A tale of punishment may align with an earthquake, yet omit the slow weakening that made collapse possible. Archaeology allows these differences to exist without forcing resolution. It acknowledges that meaning and mechanism belong to different languages. Letting archaeology lead does not silence story, it reframes it. Legends become cultural responses rather than historical accounts. They reveal how loss was processed emotionally, how communities made sense of absence. Evidence, meanwhile, reveals sequence, scale, and cause through material continuity. Together, they describe not only what happened, but how it was remembered. This balance protects understanding from exaggeration. Without archaeology, legend expands unchecked. Without legend, evidence loses human context. By holding both, interpretation gains depth without drifting into speculation. The city is allowed to be both a place and a memory. The line between legend and evidence remains permeable but clear. One belongs to meaning, the other belongs to measurement. When they are confused, history becomes either mythic or sterile. When they are aligned, loss becomes comprehensible without being theatrical. In submerged cities, this alignment matters. They rest in environments that already invite imagination. Water distorts scale, distance invites projection. By grounding interpretation in data, archaeology returns weight to stone and sequence to change. It lets cities speak through placement rather than promise. In doing so, archaeology does not strip mystery away, it reshapes it. Wonder remains, anchored to what can be known. The sea still holds stories, but their outlines are traced by evidence first. Meaning follows carefully, guided by what remains rather than what is wished for, allowing understanding to deepen without surrendering to myth. Even with careful mapping and decades of study, uncertainty still rests heavily over submerged cities. Some structures appear clearly shaped by human hands, yet resist placement in time. Their stone bears no markings that align neatly with known cultures. Without organic material to date, they remain suspended between eras, acknowledged but untethered from chronology. These undated forms sit quietly on the seafloor, present without a clear position in history. Beyond the reach of studied coastlines lie vast continental shelves that remain only lightly surveyed. Sonar coverage is uneven, often focused on areas of known interest or practical access. Large expanses of seabed hold no detailed maps at all. In these spaces, shelves descend gradually into deeper water, concealing features that may never have been noticed. Geometry waits beyond resolution, its outlines blurred by distance and scale. Some cities are known only through partial signals. A line here, a corner there, enough to suggest pattern, not enough to confirm purpose. These fragments hint at settlement without revealing layout. They imply habitation without clarifying duration or use. The ocean keeps these places just beyond certainty, offering suggestion rather than confirmation. Depth introduces another boundary. Many submerged sites lie far beyond safe diving limits. Pressure increases, light fades, and time becomes sharply restricted. Human presence gives way to remote instruments that observe without entering fully. While cameras and robotic vehicles extend reach, they still operate within limits. Fine detail is lost. Texture becomes abstraction. Understanding flattens into surface reading. Even where access exists, interpretation remains incomplete. Cities may show repeated building phases without revealing the reasons behind them. Structures overlap without explaining whether rebuilding followed prosperity, damage, or simple preference. Material remains record action, not intention. Without written context, motivation stays silent. Environmental change adds further complexity. Coastlines have shifted repeatedly over thousands of years. Water levels rose and fell. Sediment moved continuously. A structure's current position may differ significantly from where it was first built. This movement complicates assumptions about proximity to shore, access to resources, and original function. A city submerged today may have once stood well inland, its relationship with water transformed long after abandonment. There are also absences that resist explanation. In some places, architecture appears abruptly without clear precursor. In others, expected structures are missing entirely. No harbor where trade seems implied, no domestic space where population appears substantial. These gaps challenge interpretation, suggesting forms of settlement that do not fit established patterns. Technology continues to improve, but answers arrive slowly. Each advance reveals more detail, while also expanding awareness of what remains unseen. Greater resolution uncovers additional anomalies. New scans suggest further complexity. Knowledge grows outward, but clarity does not always follow at the same pace. Patience remains essential. Some questions cannot be answered yet, not because they are unimportant, but because conditions are not right. Future tools may allow gentler access. New methods may provide dating where none is possible now. Political boundaries may shift. Funding priorities may change. The cities wait without urgency. What we still do not know shapes how we approach what we do. Uncertainty encourages caution. It prevents premature conclusions. It allows space for revision rather than fixation. In underwater archaeology, restraint protects possibility. These unknowns are not failures of understanding, they are features of it. They remind us that history does not present itself fully formed. It unfolds unevenly, revealing some chapters while withholding others. Beneath the sea, cities rest in layers of partial knowledge, holding answers not yet accessible. The absence of resolution does not weaken their significance. It deepens it, allowing curiosity to remain active while certainty remains incomplete, waiting quietly beneath the water. Modern cities often see themselves as separate from the past, protected by technology and planning that earlier societies lacked. Glass towers replace stone walls, concrete replaces earth. Instruments measure what the eye once guessed. Yet beneath these advances, the same patterns continue to unfold, guided by geography rather than intention. Along many coastlines today, the ground is slowly sinking. In river deltas and reclaimed shorelines, sediment compresses under the weight of buildings just as it always has. Water drawn from beneath cities leaves spaces that collapse gradually, streets lower by centimeters that go unnoticed year to year. Foundations adjust quietly, absorbing movement without announcing it. The process looks manageable until it accumulates. At the same time, the sea is rising with patient consistency. Ports that once sat comfortably above high tide now experience routine flooding. Seawalls are raised, pumps are installed. Drainage systems work harder than before. These responses feel decisive, yet they mirror the adaptations of ancient cities that believed the balance could always be restored with another adjustment. Modern harbors face familiar pressures. Channels silt more quickly. Storms push water farther inland. Infrastructure built for earlier conditions struggles to keep pace with change that remains incremental rather than dramatic. Trade continues. Life adapts. The rhythm of activity persists even as vulnerability increases beneath it. What makes these risks difficult to recognize is their subtlety. There is no single event that marks a turning point. Instead, inconvenience grows slowly. Flooding becomes expected during certain seasons. Repairs become routine rather than exceptional. Insurance replaces memory. The city remains active, reinforcing the belief that stability has not been compromised. This quiet repetition echoes the past with precision. Ancient cities did not fall because they ignored danger entirely. They fell because each individual change felt survivable. Each response worked for a while. It was only across generations that the pattern became visible, by which time retreat felt inevitable rather than avoidable. Modern mapping now shows how closely today's urban centers align with ancient coastlines. In some regions, ports stand only slightly higher than their submerged predecessors. Roads trace paths once walked, then abandoned. The same advantages that drew early settlement continue to attract development. Access, trade, and connection still outweigh risk in the short term. Lessons rest beneath the water without insisting on attention. Submerged cities do not warn through catastrophe, they warn through continuity. They show how long adaptation can delay recognition and how quietly decisions accumulate. Their preservation allows comparison, revealing that failure often arrives without drama. The difference now lies in awareness. Unlike the past, data exists, change is measured, predictions are modeled, yet awareness does not guarantee alteration. Economic gravity still pulls cities toward the coast. Cultural attachment resists relocation. The belief that solutions will always arrive on time persists. In this way, modern cities follow ancient patterns, not through ignorance, but through familiarity. They recognize risk, manage it, and postpone its consequences. The strategy succeeds until it does not, just as it did before. Beneath contemporary ports, ancient streets rest intact, holding evidence of how long stability can appear permanent. These underwater lessons do not argue or instruct. They simply remain, offering perspective rather than warning. By observing them, modern civilization is given a rare opportunity not to escape the past, but to understand how closely it continues to follow it, step by quiet step, along the same shifting edge between land and sea. Humans have returned to the coast again and again, even after water has taken cities before. This return is not careless. It is rooted in opportunity that feels immediate and tangible. The sea concentrates movement. It gathers trade routes, resources, and exchange into narrow edges where effort yields visible reward. Fishing grounds renew themselves. Harbors shorten distances. Goods move farther with less labor. These advantages remain persuasive even when memory records loss. Economic gravity pulls steadily toward shorelines. Ports create work that multiplies outward, supporting crafts, transport, and markets beyond the water's edge. Coastal cities grow quickly because connection arrives daily. Ships bring not only cargo, but information, techniques, and influence. Inland centers rarely match this density of interaction. The coast feels alive with possibility, a place where progress appears to arrive naturally rather than being forced into existence. Alongside opportunity sits attachment. Coastal landscapes shape identity in ways that endure across generations. Songs, rituals, and seasonal rhythms align with tides and winds. Architecture faces water by habit. Cemeteries overlook bays. Memory embeds itself into place until leaving feels like abandonment of more than ground. Even when cities retreat inland, the pull of the shoreline remains, urging return when conditions seem favorable again. This attachment is reinforced by familiarity. Water behaves predictably most of the time. Tides follow cycles. Storms arrive seasonally. Calm days outnumber destructive ones. Over long stretches, the sea appears dependable enough to negotiate with. People learn its moods and believe that understanding equates to control. Risk becomes something managed rather than avoided. Acceptance follows naturally. Living near the coast involves an unspoken agreement with uncertainty. Flooding is treated as inconvenience. Erosion becomes maintenance. Rising water is addressed incrementally. Each response succeeds in the short term, reinforcing the belief that adjustment will always be possible. The risk is acknowledged, but it feels distant, diluted by years of successful adaptation. This pattern is ancient. Long before records existed, settlements formed near water despite shifting shorelines. People moved back and forth with changing conditions, returning whenever land reappeared or defenses improved. The cycle did not require denial. It required optimism grounded in experience. Life near water provided enough benefit to outweigh periodic loss. Across history, this calculation repeats. Cities rebuild after floods, ports relocate slightly higher, infrastructure improves. Each generation inherits solutions that worked for the previous one, extending confidence forward. The past becomes reassurance rather than warning. If others managed, so can we. What submerged cities reveal is not failure, but persistence. Humans do not return to the coast because they forget. They return because the advantages remain powerful and the risks unfold slowly enough to feel negotiable. The coastline offers immediacy, it offers connection, it offers the sense that life flows outward rather than inward. Even when evidence lies beneath the waves, the surface continues to invite settlement. The sea conceals its archive beneath calm water, while offering daily proof of value above it. This contrast sustains the cycle. Loss belongs to the past. Opportunity belongs to the present. In this way, returning to the coast is not repetition through ignorance. It is continuity shaped by choice. A pattern older than history persists, guided by the same forces that drew the first settlements to the water's edge. Humans return not because the coast is safe, but because it feels alive, productive, and worth negotiating with again and again across time. As centuries pass beneath the water, cities slowly stop behaving like places and begin behaving like terrain. Edges soften, surfaces lose their sharpness. Stone, once arranged with intention, starts responding to the same forces that shape cliffs and reefs. Mortar loosens, blocks fracture gently, grain by grain, architecture releases itself into sediment. This process is neither sudden nor dramatic. It unfolds at a pace that resists notice. Currents carry fine particles away, while heavier fragments settle nearby. Algae and shell bind to surfaces, blurring original lines. What once stood upright leans imperceptibly, guided by gravity and accumulation rather than design. Walls do not fall, they sink into context. Over time, distinction fades. Streets fill first, catching sediment the way valleys catch soil. Doorways disappear as thresholds rise. Rooflines dissolve beneath layers that equalize height. The city loses its negative spaces. What remains is mass rather than void, shape rather than room. Movement becomes impossible not because of collapse, but because openness no longer exists. As this happens, the city becomes readable in a different way. Instead of architecture, there is relief. Instead of neighborhoods, there are contours. The logic of human planning gives way to the logic of deposition. The city begins to function as part of the seafloor, redirecting currents, sheltering organisms, shaping flow. Stone that once carried meaning now carries weight. Its purpose shifts from symbol to structure in a new system. Blocks become anchors for coral, columns become habitats, streets become channels for water movement. The materials remain, but intention has drained away, replaced by interaction. This transition marks the surrender of human time. Cities are built to outlast lifetimes, but not to resist geological patience. Beneath the sea, calendars lose relevance. Decades and centuries blur into continuous adjustment. What once measured history now submits to process. There is no clear boundary where city ends and landscape begins. The shift is gradual, invisible from any single moment. One generation records a ruin, another records a mound, a third records a formation without recognizing its origin. Memory recedes as structure transforms. Eventually, even recognition fades. Geometry becomes irregular, alignments disappear. Only material composition hints at what once existed. Cut stone differs subtly from natural rock, but only to those who look closely. To the wider environment, it is simply substrate. This is the final stage of submersion, not disappearance, but assimilation. The city does not vanish, it changes category. It stops being cultural artifact and becomes geological feature. Its story persists, but encoded in density, mineral content, and shape rather than layout or use. In this state, the city participates fully in Earth's slower cycles. It erodes, accumulates, and stabilizes like everything else on the seafloor. Human intent no longer interrupts these rhythms. The materials are finally free from purpose. This outcome carries no judgment. It is not failure, nor is it erasure. It is continuation on a different scale. What humans assembled over generations is taken up by processes that operate across millennia. The city yields without resistance, not because it is weak, but because it has reached the point where endurance no longer requires form. When cities become geology, they achieve a quiet permanence, not the permanence of preservation, but the permanence of belonging. They settle into earth time, becoming part of a landscape that will outlast memory, holding their substance long after their stories have dissolved into sediment alongside them. The ocean keeps memory without deciding to do so. It does not choose what to protect or what to erase. It simply receives what enters it and reshapes it according to slow, consistent rules. Cities that slip beneath the surface are not archived through care, but through circumstance. Depth reduces disturbance, water softens extremes, sediment settles patiently. In this way, the ocean becomes a keeper of memory without intention. Unlike land, where wind, rain, and human use accelerate change, the underwater world limits motion. Once structures settle, they are sheltered from many forces that would otherwise scatter them. Walls remain aligned, floors remain level, objects stay close to where they last belonged. The ocean does not tell stories, yet it holds them intact through stillness. These stories exist without language. There are no inscriptions explaining purpose. No voices remain to clarify meaning. What persists instead is arrangement, the position of streets, the spacing of rooms, the relationship between workspaces and homes. Through these quiet patterns, daily life becomes readable without being narrated. Memory survives in form rather than description. This kind of preservation removes urgency. Time underwater behaves differently. Change continues, but slowly enough to feel suspended. Centuries pass without visible alteration. A city abandoned generations ago can appear much as it did when last inhabited. This creates the impression of pause, as if history inhaled and never exhaled again. Silence strengthens this effect. Sound travels differently beneath the surface, dampened and diffuse. The absence of human noise becomes total. Without echo or interruption, places feel complete rather than emptied. The lack of activity does not suggest absence, but rest. History seems to be waiting rather than ending. The ocean also protects by separating. Distance limits access. Depth discourages disturbance. Many cities remain untouched not because they are unknown, but because they are difficult to reach. This difficulty functions as preservation. Curiosity slows. Intervention becomes careful. The memory held there remains largely undisturbed, not through design, but through inaccessibility. As time stretches, these submerged spaces accumulate layers of additional history. Marine life weaves through walls, sediment records, seasonal patterns, chemical changes trace shifts in climate. The city becomes part of a larger archive that includes both human and environmental memory. It records not only what people built, but what followed after they left. This layered memory carries no hierarchy. The ocean does not elevate one moment over another. Early occupation, abandonment, submersion, and transformation are all preserved as part of a continuous sequence. There is no emphasis, only accumulation. Events rest beside one another without commentary. Because of this, interpretation remains gentle. Observers are not confronted with collapse or destruction, they encounter continuity. The ocean does not dramatize loss, it absorbs it. What could feel tragic on land becomes calm beneath the waves, softened by distance and time. In this calm, memory remains active without demanding response. The cities do not ask to be understood, they allow understanding if approached slowly. Their preservation invites reflection rather than reaction. Time beneath the waves moves at a scale that resists hurry. Processes stretch beyond individual lifetimes, meaning unfolds gradually. The ocean keeps what enters it not by remembering, but by not forgetting quickly. In doing so, it offers a rare form of continuity, where history rests without explanation, held quietly in place, slowed enough to remain intact, waiting without words beneath the water. Beyond the mapped coasts and documented ruins, the seafloor stretches outward into spaces that remain largely unknown. Continental shelves extend far from land, broad and gently sloping, shaped by ancient shorelines that once lay exposed. These submerged expanses were not empty when seas were lower. They held rivers, wetlands, and settlements that followed familiar patterns of access and survival. Today, they wait beneath layers of water and sediment, mostly unexamined. Much of this seafloor has never been closely surveyed. Charts prioritize navigation rather than archaeology. Attention gathers where discovery has already occurred, leaving wide regions untouched simply because nothing has drawn focus there yet. Absence of study does not indicate absence of history. It reflects the scale of the environment and the limits of exploration so far. Technology is slowly changing that balance. Tools that once belonged only to deep ocean science now drift closer to archaeological use. High-resolution sonar sweeps larger areas with greater clarity. Autonomous vehicles move patiently across depths that human divers cannot reach. Imaging systems assemble landscapes from fragments of data, revealing patterns that resemble streets, walls, and foundations without disturbing them. These methods do not reveal cities instantly. They offer hints, straight lines, where geology rarely produces them, repeated angles that suggest planning rather than chance. Subtle elevations that align too closely to ignore. Each signal invites attention without demanding conclusion. Discovery begins as suggestion rather than certainty. As reach expands, so does awareness of how much remains concealed. For every identified site, countless others may lie nearby, masked by sediment or overlooked by coarse resolution. Ancient coastlines shifted repeatedly, leaving layers of habitation stacked across time. Some settlements were short-lived, others endured for centuries. Many were reclaimed quietly as water advanced. Their traces blend with natural features until technology learns how to distinguish them. The ocean holds these places without classification. It does not label importance or preserve selectively. Everything rests together, altered by the same slow forces. A forgotten village may lie beside a once powerful port, both reduced to form and material. Discovery depends not on status, but on chance alignment between method and location. This unfinished archive resists narrative closure. Each revealed structure expands context rather than completing it. A city does not stand alone. It implies roads, satellites, and networks that have yet to be found. Understanding grows outward, encouraging patience rather than resolution. Future exploration will not uncover everything at once. It will proceed unevenly, shaped by access, funding, and shifting interest. Some sites will remain untouched intentionally, preserved by distance. Others will be documented gradually, their outlines becoming clearer as tools improve. The pace will remain slow, not because of lack, but because scale demands it. What waits offshore is not a hidden civilization waiting to overturn history. It is continuity extending beyond current maps. These cities belong where they are found, integrated into broader human movement across changing landscapes. Their importance lies not in surprise, but in accumulation. As technology refines vision, the seafloor will grow more legible without becoming crowded. Each discovery will add texture to understanding, not overwhelm it. The ocean's archive will remain incomplete, not because it is failing to reveal itself, but because it is vast. In this way, discovery becomes an ongoing relationship rather than a conclusion. The seafloor holds more than can be known at once. It offers history at a pace matched to the patience required to receive it. Cities wait offshore, not concealed, but resting, part of an archive that remains open, unfinished, and quietly expansive beneath the waves. Some cities do not end, they simply thin. Life withdraws gradually, leaving less behind each season. Boats stop coming as often, markets open fewer days. Streets remain intact, yet their rhythm changes so slowly that no moment stands apart as an ending. There is no single day to remember, no record that marks the last gathering or the final departure. In these places, the absence of catastrophe defines the loss. No fire consumes the roofs, no armies arrive to break walls. The city continues functioning even as participation fades. Houses remain occupied until they are not. Workshops close one by one. Activity does not collapse, it disperses. Records, when they exist, offer little clarity. They speak of trade slowing, not stopping, of repairs becoming irregular, of shifts in priority rather than retreat. What appears at first as decline often looks like adjustment, and adjustment can persist for generations. The city remains recognizable long after its importance has waned. As population decreases, space begins to feel larger. Streets grow quieter without becoming empty. Structures remain in use long after the social network that supported them has thinned. The city feels intact, even as its center of gravity shifts elsewhere. Life continues at the margins. This gradualness obscures the moment of abandonment. People leave in groups small enough to feel temporary. Some depart seasonally, expecting to return. Others relocate permanently, but maintain ties. The idea of leaving never arrives all at once. It unfolds as practicality rather than decision. Over time, fewer boats anchor at the harbor. Fewer repairs are made to docks. Channels silt without regular clearing. The city still faces the sea, but its engagement weakens. What once required constant attention begins to accept neglect. Infrastructure survives for a while, without use, then begins to fail quietly. Water advances into this silence without resistance. It does not arrive as an enemy. It fills low ground first, then spreads into unused spaces. Flooded streets remain visible after tides recede. Each return leaves traces behind, marking change without urgency. The city accommodates these intrusions until accommodation is no longer possible. Without a recorded end, memory loses its anchor. There is no story of loss to retell. Later generations inherit fragments rather than narrative. They remember where the city was, not how it ended. Absence becomes a condition rather than an event. Archaeology reflects this quiet departure. There are no burn layers or mass graves to interpret. Instead, there are patterns of thinning use, objects left where they last served purpose, buildings that show maintenance gaps rather than damage, a city preserved not by interruption, but by completion of withdrawal. Eventually, water remains where people once moved. The transition feels final only in hindsight. From within the process, it would have appeared reasonable, incremental, even manageable. Only when viewed across long spans does the full arc become visible. Cities without endings challenge how history is understood. They do not conform to narratives of rise and fall. Their disappearance leaves no sharp outline. It blends with continuity rather than breaking from it. The absence of a climax does not reduce significance, it deepens it. When these cities rest beneath the sea, their quiet endings persist. They remain legible, not as ruins of disaster, but as records of patience. Their loss was not declared, it was absorbed. Life moved elsewhere, leaving form behind. In the end, there was no final moment to remember, only fewer people, fewer boats, and then water, resting gently in place of habit. These submerged cities do not speak loudly about the past. They reveal it through pattern and repetition. Across different coasts, cultures, and eras, similar choices appear again and again. Humans adapt quickly to opportunity. They build where resources gather, where movement is easy, where exchange multiplies effort into prosperity. The sea offered abundance, and people learned how to live alongside it with remarkable flexibility. Adaptability shows itself in layered construction and repeated repair. Cities adjusted to shifting conditions without abandoning place immediately. Walls were raised, streets were rerouted, harbors were extended. When water intruded, solutions followed. These adjustments reflect ingenuity rather than denial. People responded to change, using the knowledge available to them, extending habit into altered conditions. At the same time, these cities also reveal limits. Adaptation worked until it no longer did. Each adjustment solved a problem temporarily, but not permanently. Rising water, weakening ground, or shifting trade eventually exceeded what incremental change could manage. The capacity to respond existed, but it was finite. Human systems proved flexible, not infinite. This balance between resilience and constraint becomes visible only across long spans. In the short term, cities functioned well. In the long term, conditions accumulated beyond control. The lesson is not failure, but scale. Human planning operates on generational time. Environmental change operates across broader horizons. When those timelines diverge too far, even effective adaptation reaches an edge. Abundance played a central role in this dynamic. Coastal environments offered food, trade, and connection concentrated into narrow zones. Living near such abundance produced growth, complexity, and cultural richness. It also increased exposure. The same access that supported prosperity tied survival to forces beyond direct influence. When abundance shifts location or behavior, dependence becomes vulnerability. These cities show the cost of proximity. The rewards of coastal life were immediate and visible. The risks were distant and gradual. This imbalance favored settlement even when danger was understood. People accepted trade offs not because they ignored risk, but because the benefits shaped daily existence more powerfully than future uncertainty. What emerges beneath the sea is fragility layered beneath apparent permanence. Stone walls suggested stability, careful layout implied control, yet permanence was visual, not absolute. The materials endured longer than the systems that relied on them. Architecture outlasted occupation, revealing how easily the sense of durability can exceed reality. These ruins also remind us that civilization does not require collapse to end. It can thin, adapt, relocate, and leave behind solid forms without dramatic failure. The cities were not erased by sudden catastrophe alone. Many simply lost their viability as centers. People moved, carrying culture with them, leaving structure behind. What these cities ultimately reveal is humility. They show how much humans can do and how much remains beyond negotiation. They illustrate creativity paired with constraint, ambition paired with acceptance. Near abundance, civilization flourished. Near change, it adjusted. When conditions surpassed adjustment, it yielded quietly. Beneath the waves, these places hold a mirror, not one that judges, but one that reflects continuity. The same choices recur, the same strengths apply, the same limits emerge. The fragility revealed is not weakness, but reality. Permanence has always been conditional. These cities remind us that endurance lies not in resisting change forever, but in understanding how and when to move with it, leaving traces behind that tell the story softly, long after the water settles. Beneath the surface, cities continue to exist without declaring themselves. Streets rest in darkness, their paths intact, their directions unchanged. Stone still defines where movement once flowed, even though nothing moves there now. The layout remains patient, holding form without purpose, as if waiting for footsteps that will never return. These streets are not ruined, they are simply unoccupied. Homes endure in similar stillness. Walls still divide rooms meant for rest and gathering. Thresholds remain worn smooth from use that ended quietly. Roofs have softened or settled, yet the interior spaces retain proportion and balance. No one owns these homes anymore, yet they are preserved by conditions that resist disturbance. Absence becomes their defining feature, replacing use without damaging structure. Light reaches these cities only in fragments. It filters down unevenly, touching stone and shadow without preference. In some places, it never arrives at all. Darkness does not erase detail, it shelters it. Under low light, edges blur gently, allowing the city to recede into itself. What cannot be seen fully remains complete in form, resting beyond constant observation. Time moves differently here. Days and years lose distinction. Change continues, but at a pace that feels suspended. Sediment settles slowly. Water circulates calmly. The city does not register passing moments. It holds them. Layers accumulate without urgency, allowing history to compress rather than scatter. The result feels less like decay and more like rest. These cities do not demand attention. They are content to remain where they are, undisturbed by curiosity or neglect. Their presence is steady rather than dramatic. They do not announce loss. They embody continuity shaped by withdrawal. Everything that once defined daily life has receded, leaving behind spaces that hold the imprint without repeating the action. Some of these places are known and mapped. Others exist only as suggestion, faint outlines detected far offshore. Still more lie beyond the limits of current exploration, their existence inferred rather than confirmed. The seafloor holds more history than has been named, more structure than has been measured. Many cities remain unseen, not lost, simply untouched. This unfinished state is not temporary, it is enduring. The ocean does not hurry toward revelation. It keeps what it holds at its own pace. Discovery occurs gradually, shaped by patience rather than pursuit. What remains hidden does so without resistance, folded into depth and distance that preserve without explanation. Together, these cities form a quiet record, streets resting without sound, homes waiting without occupants, history held without narration. Their sleep is not inactivity, it is preservation through stillness. Beneath the waves, they remain complete enough to be recognized, distant enough to remain undisturbed, and numerous enough to suggest that what has been found is only a fraction. The sea continues to hold them gently, allowing time to move slowly above while below, the cities sleep on, resting in darkness, waiting without urgency, unseen and intact beneath the water.